The heir's mother, once full of life, mysteriously wastes away as her daughter-in-law controls every meal with cold justifications. Everything changes when a humble housekeeper reveals that the elderly woman is being deliberately prevented from eating. The truth explodes like a bomb at a lavish dinner party, and the heir finds himself facing the greatest mistake of his life. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. The Anderson mansion stood imposingly in the Upper East Side of New York City, its high walls and impeccable gardens concealing more than they revealed. Behind the wrought-iron gates and marble-clad walls, a family that seemed to have it all lived under a veil of carefully maintained appearances. Edward Anderson, heir to a family empire built over decades in the real estate business, woke every morning in the master bedroom of that residence with the feeling that something fundamental had changed, though he couldn't quite define what. At 42, Edward had always been a man of well-established routines. He woke up early, had his breakfast while reading the financial papers, spent the day managing the family business and returned home in the late afternoon. Married for 7 years to Fiona, a woman of striking beauty and elegant posture whom he had met at a charity event, Edward believed he had built the perfect life. Fiona came from an upper-middle-class family, held a degree in business, administration, and from the beginning had shown a genuine interest in the Andersons' business. She had fit perfectly into the role of a successful businessman's wife, always impeccable at social events, always with the right word at the right time. But something had been unsettling Edward in recent months, something that had started so subtly he had barely noticed. His mother, Helena, a 73-year-old woman who had always been the beating heart of that house, had begun to wither away. The vibrant woman he had known his whole life, the one who walked through the gardens every morning, who personally supervised the preparation of meals, who laughed loudly at family gatherings, was transforming into a pale shadow of her former self. Edward remembered when it all began to change. It had been about 8 months ago, shortly after Fiona had completely taken over Helena's care. At the time, it had seemed like a generous gesture from his daughter-in-law, almost an act of filial affection. Fiona had argued that a woman of her age needed special attention, a balanced diet, and care that only someone dedicated could provide. Edward, always busy with business, had gladly accepted. After all, what son wouldn't be grateful to see his wife caring so diligently for his mother? But Helena had started to lose weight. At first, Edward attributed it to her age. After all, elderly people sometimes lost their appetite, developed different food preferences. Fiona always had a ready explanation. She would say his mother was on a special diet recommended by a private nutritionist, that it was necessary to control salt, sugar, and fats, that Helena had developed some food intolerances and needed specific meals. Edward trusted his wife, why wouldn't he? Now, however, watching his mother at the breakfast table on that September morning, Edward felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't ignore. Helena was unrecognizable. Her grey hair, once always neatly combed, seemed lifeless. Her skin, once rosy and healthy, was ashen, almost transparent. Her hands trembled as she held her teacup, and she had barely managed 2 spoonfuls of porridge before letting the spoon clatter onto the table, as if the simple act of lifting her arm required superhuman effort. Fiona, sitting beside Edward, watched everything with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was something too controlled in her gaze, something calculated in the way she immediately rose to help Helena, removing the still full plate and replacing it with a smaller bowl of what appeared to be just a thin broth. "Your mother is strong. She'll get through this," Fiona would say with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just a phase, darling. Age brings these changes. I'm taking care of everything, don't you worry." Edward wanted to believe her. God, how he wanted to believe her. But there was something about the whole situation that made his instincts scream for attention, especially when he looked into his mother's eyes. Eyes that once sparkled with intelligence and vivacity now seemed dull, almost pleading, as if they wanted to say something that words could not express. The Anderson house was not just a residence. It was a small universe with its own hierarchy and dynamics. Besides the family, there were the staff who kept everything running perfectly. Rose was one of them, At 36, she had been working at the mansion for nearly 5 years, initially as a kitchen assistant and later taking on general cleaning and organizing duties. Rose was a simple woman of humble origins, born and raised in the Bronx. Her face was marked by the sun and hard work, but her eyes carried a genuine kindness that did not go unnoticed. Rose lived in a small room at the back of the property with her son, Lucas, a 10-year-old boy who walked with the help of crutches due to a congenital malformation in one of his legs. The boy was the result of a relationship that hadn't worked out, and Rose was raising him alone, working tirelessly to ensure he had a proper education and medical care. Edward had always been generous with her, allowing Lucas to live on the property and even helping with some treatment costs. It was the kind of gesture that made Edward feel good about himself, as if he were somehow giving back for the blessings life had bestowed upon him. But Rose had been observing things that left her deeply disturbed. She had known Helena since she started working there. The old lady had always been kind to her, treating her with respect and even maternal affection. Rose remembered how Helena used to come down to the kitchen on Sunday mornings to personally prepare lunch, sharing family recipes and telling stories of when Edward was a child. That vibrant woman, full of energy and love for life, was disappearing before everyone's eyes, and Rose noticed things that others didn't see or didn't want to see. She had noticed how Fiona controlled every one of Helena's meals with an almost obsessive rigidity. How her daughter-in-law wouldn't allow anyone else to bring food to her mother-in-law, insisting that only she knew exactly what the old lady could or could not eat. Rose had witnessed moments when she prepared a special dish, following Fiona's instructions, only to see the boss's wife take it upstairs and return minutes later, saying that Helena had no appetite. But Rose could hear the old lady's stomach rumbling with hunger when she passed by in the hallway. Then there were the vials. Rose had seen them a few times when she entered the master bedroom to clean. Small, unidentifiable glass vials, kept in the drawer of Fiona's bedside table. Once, driven by curiosity and growing concern, Rose had tried to examine one of them more closely, but Fiona had entered the room at that exact moment. The look her employer gave her was icy, as sharp as a blade. "You are not permitted to touch my personal belongings, Rose," Fiona had said in a low voice, but one laced with a veiled threat. "I hope this doesn't happen again. It would be a shame if I had to reconsider your position here, especially considering your son. He needs this stability so much, doesn't he?" Rose felt her blood run cold. The threat was clear. Any questioning, any deeper investigation could result in her dismissal, and she couldn't afford to lose that job. Lucas depended on her. The medical treatments, the school, everything depended on the stability that job provided. So Rose had lowered her head, apologized, and returned to her work, but the seed of suspicion was already planted. Lucas, despite his young age, was an observant boy. He spent most of his day studying at home, supervised by a private tutor Edward had hired, but he had free moments when he would wander the property. Because of his crutches, his pace was slow, and this made him almost invisible to those who lived too hurried a life to notice a quiet child in the corners. The boy liked Helena. She had always been kind to him, giving him books and talking about the adventure stories he loved. In recent months, however, Lucas had begun to notice strange things. He had seen more than once his employer taking food to Helena's room and leaving minutes later with the plate almost untouched. He had seen Fiona locking her mother-in-law's door from the outside at certain times of the day, saying the old lady needed absolute rest. He had also witnessed moments of subtle cruelty, like when Fiona pinched Helena's arm hard enough to leave a mark, but with a smile on her face as she whispered something Lucas couldn't hear. The boy had tried to tell his mother, but Rose, terrified of losing her job, had asked him not to get into trouble. "Son, sometimes adults have their reasons for doing things," she had said, though her own voice trembled with doubt. "We can't meddle in matters that aren't our business. We need this job, you understand, don't you?" Lucas understood, but he also understood that something very wrong was happening to the lady he was so fond of. And unlike his mother, who was paralyzed by fear, the boy had started to do something about it. He began to write down everything he saw in an old notebook, dates, times, descriptions of the behaviors he witnessed. It was his way of helping, even if he didn't yet know how that information could be useful. Edward, meanwhile, remained immersed in his work routines, but his concern for his mother grew with each passing day. He had tried a few times to take over some of Helena's care, but Fiona always found a way to block his attempts. She would say he didn't understand his mother's special needs, that his presence agitated the old lady too much, that it was better to leave the care in the hands of someone who really knew what they were doing. And Edward, conditioned by years of marriage to trust his wife's judgment, would eventually give in. Fiona had always been so competent in everything she did. She managed the house with impeccable efficiency, organized social events that impressed the most demanding guests, maintained the appearances of a perfect family. Why would she lie about caring for her mother-in-law? What reason would she have to harm Helena? But there were moments, especially at night, when Edward would wake up suddenly, seized by an inexplicable anguish. Moments when he would find himself looking at his wife sleeping beside him and feeling a chill he couldn't justify. Moments when he would go down to his mother's room, only to find the door locked and Fiona emerging from somewhere in the shadows, saying that Helena was resting and should not be disturbed. Rose, for her part, continued to watch, and with each passing day, her conviction that something profoundly wrong was happening solidified. She saw the meals she prepared following Fiona's instructions, meals that seemed insufficient even for a child, let alone a woman who needed to regain her strength. She saw how Fiona controlled every interaction Helena had with other people, including her own son. She saw the growing pallor, the ever-increasing weakness, the tremors that took over the body of that once strong lady. One afternoon, when Edward was on a business trip to Chicago and Fiona had gone out for a social engagement, Rose gathered all her courage and decided to visit Helena. She went up the stairs with her heart pounding, carrying a tray with homemade soup she had prepared in secret, using nutritious ingredients she knew the old lady liked. The bedroom door was unlocked, a rarity. Rose knocked softly and entered. What she saw made her gasp in shock. Helena was lying in bed, so thin that her bones protruded under her skin. Her eyes, sunken in their sockets, lit up when she saw Rose, and she tried to sit up, but she didn't have the strength. "Rose, my dear." Helena's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Did you bring food? I'm so hungry, so very hungry." Tears welled up in Rose's eyes as she quickly approached, supporting the old lady and helping her to sit up. "Mrs. Helena, what's happening? Why are you like this?" The elderly woman opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment they heard the sound of a car arriving. Fiona was back early. Rose saw panic seize Helena's eyes, a fear so visceral it confirmed all her suspicions. "She can't see me here," the old lady whispered, grabbing Rose's hand with a surprising strength for someone so weak. "She'll punish you. She'll send you away. Please go. But promise me you won't forget me. Promise you'll help in some way." Rose promised, tears streaming down her face. She left the tray hidden in a corner and left quickly, going down through the back of the house before Fiona could see her. But in that moment something shifted inside her. The fear was still there, but now there was something stronger. A determination, an absolute certainty that she had to do something, regardless of the consequences. That night, when Edward returned from his trip, Rose watched him from a distance as he had dinner with Fiona. She saw how his wife smiled, how she made small talk, how she perfectly played the role of the devoted wife. And she also saw how Edward, tired from his trip, failed to notice the signs. He didn't see the calculated coldness behind that smile. He didn't understand that the danger lived inside his own house, wearing elegant clothes and French perfume. Rose knew she had to act, but she also knew she needed proof. Something concrete that would force Edward to see the truth. Because without proof, she would just be another maid making baseless accusations against her employer. And in that house, in that mansion of perfect appearances, the word of a humble woman was worth nothing against the word of Fiona Anderson. But Rose had something Fiona didn't. She had the eyes of someone who knew pain, who had fought her whole life for survival. She knew how to recognize evil even when it was disguised in elegance, and more importantly, she had an unlikely ally. Lucas, with his notebook full of notes, with his silent observation, and his childish courage that the adults had already lost. The Anderson mansion, with its perfect gardens and immaculate facades, held a dark secret, and Rose was determined to expose it, even if it cost her everything she had, because some things were more important than job security. Some things, like the life of a kind woman, who didn't deserve the suffering being inflicted upon her, were worth any risk. The following days brought a growing tension to that house. Edward had begun to pay more attention, driven by an instinct he could no longer ignore. He noticed how his mother avoided Fiona's gaze, how she flinched when his wife approached. He also noticed how Rose seemed to walk on eggshells, with a constant vigilance that did not go unnoticed. Something was deeply wrong, and Edward, for the first time in months, allowed himself to question whether he had been blind all this time, whether Fiona's explanations were really justifications or just smokescreens to hide something terrible. The doubt, once planted, began to grow, casting shadows over all the certainties he had built about his perfect life. The storm was about to break, and when it did, nothing in that mansion would ever be the same again. The preparation for the charity dinner to be held at the Anderson mansion had begun weeks earlier. Fiona organized everything personally, with a meticulousness that bordered on obsession. It was an important event, bringing together influential business leaders, politicians, and high society personalities from New York. More than a dinner, it was an opportunity to consolidate connections, to showcase the power and influence of the Anderson family, and Fiona knew exactly how to shine on these occasions. Edward watched his wife coordinating the preparations with impressive efficiency. She had personally chosen every detail of the decor, the menu, the guest list. The mansion was being transformed into a scene worthy of a magazine, with imported flowers adorning every room, crystal chandeliers glittering under strategically placed lights, and a team of impeccably uniformed waiters, ready to serve the most demanding guests. But Edward couldn't fully concentrate on the preparations. His mind kept returning to his mother, whose condition continued to deteriorate alarmingly. Helena could now barely get out of bed without help, and her moments of lucidity seemed increasingly rare, interspersed with periods of confusion and extreme weakness. Edward had suggested several times that perhaps it would be better to postpone the event, that the presence of so many people might be too much for his mother in her state. But Fiona had been adamant. "Edward, your mother needs routine, life happening around her," his wife had argued with that logic that always seemed to make sense on the surface. Isolating her completely would be worse. Besides, the dinner has been scheduled for months. Canceling now would be a disaster for the business and our reputation. Do you want people to start speculating that something is wrong? It could even affect investor confidence. Edward had given in, as always, but the unease continued to grow within him, fueled by the increasingly troubled glances Rose cast in his direction whenever they crossed paths in the hallways. There was something the housekeeper wanted to say. He could see that clearly. But whenever he tried to broach the subject, Rose would avert her, gaze and quickly walk away, as if she were afraid to speak. Lucas, Rose's son, continued his silent observations. The notebook where he wrote everything down was getting fuller. He had seen Fiona enter Helena's room with small vials hidden in her hands. He had seen his employer adding drops of a clear liquid to soups before taking them to her mother-in-law. He had also seen, on an occasion that had deeply disturbed him, Fiona holding a pillow over Helena's face for a few seconds while the old lady slept as if she were testing something, before pulling away with a cold smile on her lips. The boy had told his mother all of this, and Rose had felt her stomach churn with horror. She knew she had to act, but she also knew that without concrete proof, it would be her word against Fiona's. And in that world of appearances and social hierarchies, her word was worth nothing. But the situation was reaching a critical point. Helena was dying before everyone's eyes, and no one seemed to want to see the truth. On the night of the dinner, the mansion was filled with elegantly dressed guests. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns circulated through the halls, talking about business, politics, and high society trifles. Fiona was radiant, wearing a navy blue dress that enhanced her silhouette, with discreet but expensive jewelry sparkling at her neck and wrists. She moved among the guests with grace and ease, always with the right word, the perfect smile, the impeccable posture. Edward was by her side, playing his role as host, but his attention was divided. He had noticed that his mother hadn't come down for dinner, despite Fiona insisting that she should make a brief appearance. His wife had explained to the guests that Helena was feeling a bit unwell, but would join them shortly. It was a polite lie, but Edward knew the truth was far more serious. His mother could barely sit up, let alone attend a social event. Rose was working that night, assisting in the kitchen and serving the guests. She wore a simple but clean uniform, and moved through the halls with the typical invisibility of those who serve. But her eyes were watchful, observing everything. She had seen Fiona go up to Helena's room twice during the dinner, always with the excuse of checking if her mother-in-law needed anything. And she had also seen the satisfied expression on her employer's face when she returned, as if she were pleased with something no one else understood. It was during the main course, when everyone was seated at the grand table in the ballroom, that something inside Rose finally snapped. She was serving wine to the guests when she heard Fiona responding to a question from one of the guests, an elegant lady who had inquired about Helena's health. "It's age. You know how it is," Fiona had said with a theatrical sigh. "We've tried everything. The best diets, the best medical care. But sometimes the body just doesn't respond as we'd like. It's so sad to see someone we love wither away like this, but we're doing everything in our power, absolutely everything." The cynicism of those words, the blatant lie uttered with such naturalness, was too much for Rose. She felt a wave of righteous anger rise from the pit of her stomach, an indignation that could no longer be contained. Without fully thinking about the consequences, without calculating the risks, Rose took a step forward. "With all due respect, ma'am," Rose's voice came out louder than she intended, cutting through the conversations around the table. "That's not true." The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes turned to her. Edward froze with his fork in mid-air. Fiona turned slowly, and Rose saw something flash behind those perfectly made-up eyes. It was fury, pure and cold. "Rose," Fiona said in a low voice laden with warning, "you are forgetting your place." But Rose had already gone too far to back down. Her heart was pounding like a drum, her hands were shaking. But the words kept coming. "No, ma'am, I can't stay silent any longer. You are not taking care of Mrs. Helena. You are stopping her from eating. You control every meal, every piece of food that reaches her." "I've seen it, ma'am. I've seen it many times." The embarrassment was palpable. The guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to react to this unthinkable scene. A maid accusing the lady of the house in front of everyone. It was absurd, a scandal. Fiona rose slowly, with impressive self-control. Her face was pale with rage, but her voice remained calm, almost sweet. "Rose, you are clearly confused. Perhaps the overwork is affecting your judgment. Edward, darling, I think it would be best to dismiss Rose for the night. She obviously needs to rest." Edward was stunned, torn between loyalty to his wife and the impact of these accusations that echoed his own unadmitted suspicions. He looked at Rose, saw the tears in the housekeeper's eyes, saw the desperate sincerity on her face, and then he looked at Fiona, saw the perfect mask of outraged indignation. Which one was telling the truth? "Rose, please," Edward began, his voice hesitant. "I think you should—" But Rose wasn't leaving, not yet, not after coming this far. She turned to Edward, completely ignoring Fiona's growing fury. "Mr. Edward, her son, please open your eyes. Look at the state your mother is in. Ask yourself if this is really just age. Ask why your wife won't let anyone else take care of Mrs. Helena, why she controls everything so rigidly, why there are unlabeled vials in her room." It was the mention of the vials that made something shift in Fiona's face. For a split second, the mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. But she recovered quickly, turning to the guests with an apologetic smile. "I apologize to everyone for this embarrassing scene. Clearly, we are dealing with a mental health issue here. Rose has been going through some difficult times in her personal life, and unfortunately it's affecting her perception of reality. We will make sure she gets the proper help." Rose felt the tears roll freely now. She knew how it sounded. A maid making absurd accusations against her employer. Who would believe her? but she tried one last time. "Please, you have to believe me. Mrs. Helena is suffering, she's starving, she's being—" "Enough!" Fiona's voice cut like a whip. "Edward, remove this woman from here, now." Edward stood up, his face red with embarrassment. He approached Rose, gently taking her by the arm. His voice was low when he spoke. "Rose, please, you're making everything worse. We'll sort this out later, but right now you need to leave." Rose allowed herself to be led out of the ballroom, feeling the eyes of all the guests on her back. She heard murmurs, whispered comments about out-of-control staff, about how hard it was to find reliable employees these days. And she also heard Fiona's voice resuming the conversation with ease, turning that horrible moment into an anecdote, about the challenges of managing a large house. But then something happened that no one expected. Helena, who had somehow found the strength to come down the stairs, appeared at the entrance of the ballroom. She was in her nightgown, barefoot, leaning against the wall to keep from falling. Her face was so pale it seemed translucent, and her eyes, sunken in their sockets, looked around with an expression of confusion and despair. Everyone in the room turned to look. The silence was instant and absolute. Edward dropped Rose's arm and ran towards his mother. "Helena, Mom, what are you doing here? You should be resting." Helena opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She staggered, her knees buckled, and before Edward could reach her, she collapsed to the floor like a rag doll. The sound of her body falling was followed by cries of alarm from the guests. Edward knelt beside his mother, holding her in his arms. "Mom, Mom, wake up! Someone call an ambulance! Quickly!" Fiona approached as well, but there was something strange in her expression. It wasn't the expected panic of someone seeing their mother-in-law collapse, but something closer to irritation, as if this were an inconvenient setback. She quickly adjusted her expression to something more appropriate, but Rose had seen it. Lucas, who was watching everything from a corner, had seen it too. The ambulance arrived in 15 minutes that felt like an eternity. The paramedics quickly assessed Helena and placed her on a stretcher. Edward accompanied them, insisting on going along. Fiona tried to join them, but Edward stopped her with a sharp gesture that surprised everyone. "Stay here and take care of the guests," he said, his voice harder than Fiona had ever heard it. "I'm going with my mother." It was the first time in 7 years of marriage that Edward had directly denied his wife anything, and it was also the first time that a real seed of doubt began to germinate in his heart. Because as he looked at Fiona's face in that moment, seeing the poorly disguised irritation, remembering Rose's words, something clicked inside him. A horrifying realization began to take shape, still hazy, still resisted, but undeniable. At the hospital, Helena was immediately taken to the emergency room. Edward stayed in the waiting room, his hands trembling, his heart racing. He thought of all. The times he had ignored the signs, of all Fiona's explanations he had accepted without question. He thought of Rose's face as she made those terrible accusations, the desperate sincerity in her voice. He thought of his mother withering away day after day, while he was too busy, too trusting, too blind to see. After what felt like hours, a doctor came out to speak with him. She was a middle-aged woman with a serious, concerned look. "Mr. Anderson," she began, sitting down next to him, "we need to talk about your mother's condition." "How is she?" Edward asked, his voice hoarse. "Stabilized for now. But Mr. Anderson, I need to be frank with you. Your mother is severely malnourished. Preliminary tests show signs of severe dehydration, dangerously low levels of essential vitamins and minerals, and there are also indications that she may have been exposed to substances that cause nausea and vomiting. The full results are still being processed, but the picture we're seeing is extremely worrying." Edward felt the world spin around him. "Malnourished? How is that possible? She has all the care, all the meals—" The doctor interrupted him gently. "Mr. Anderson, a person does not reach this state of malnutrition by chance or simple lack of appetite. Something is very wrong here. Your mother has not been receiving adequate nutrition for months, possibly, and the signs of exposure to substances that cause illness suggest this is not accidental neglect. I would strongly recommend that you investigate the circumstances of the care your mother has been receiving." The doctor's words echoed in Edward's mind like funeral bells. Rose was right. Dear God, Rose had been right all along. and he had humiliated her, dismissed her, refused to listen. Meanwhile, his mother was being systematically destroyed inside his own house under his own watch. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice breaking. "She's sedated now, but yes, you can go in for a few minutes." Edward entered the hospital room on legs that could barely support him. Helena lay in the bed, with tubes and monitors connected to her frail body. She looked so small, so vulnerable. Edward approached, took her hand carefully, and let the tears finally fall. "Mum, forgive me," he whispered. "I was so blind, so terribly blind. But I swear to you, I swear I will find out the truth, and if someone did this to you on purpose, I will get justice, I promise." Helena couldn't hear him, lost in her medically induced sleep, but somewhere deep in her consciousness, perhaps she felt that something was changing, that finally, after months of silent suffering, someone was beginning to see the truth. Edward stayed at the hospital all night, refusing to leave his mother alone. He ignored Fiona's insistent calls, who wanted to know what was happening, when he would be home. Every time the phone rang and he saw his wife's name on the screen, he felt a mixture of anger and nausea. How had he not seen it before? How had he been so naive? The next morning, as the sun began to rise over New York City, Edward made a decision. He called Rose. The housekeeper answered on the second ring, her voice tense and worried. "Rose, it's me, Edward. I need to talk to you. I need you to tell me everything, absolutely everything you saw and suspected." And Rose, he paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Forgive me for not believing you yesterday. Forgive me for being so blind." On the other end of the line, Rose began to cry, crying from relief, from fear, from hope. "Mr. Edward, I'll tell you everything, everything I saw, everything my son saw, but you need to be prepared, because it's much worse than you imagine. Much worse." "I'm prepared," Edward replied, though he wasn't sure he was. "Meet me at the hospital as soon as you can. And Rose, bring everything you have. Any proof, any observation, anything that can help us understand what really happened to my mother." After hanging up, Edward looked out the hospital window, watching the city awaken to another day. But for him, this was not just another day. It was the day his carefully constructed life began to crumble, the day he realized the monster wasn't outside but inside his own home, sharing his bed, using his last name. And he was determined to expose that monster, no matter the cost. Because his mother deserved justice. Rose deserved an apology that words could never fully express. And he, Edward, needed to face his own blindness and do what he should have done months ago. Protect the one he loved, even if it meant destroying the life he knew. Rose arrived at the hospital 2 hours after Edward's call, bringing Lucas with her and a worn-out cloth bag that she carried as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. The boy walked beside his mother on his crutches, his eyes wide with the gravity of the moment. They were met by Edward in the waiting room, and the transformation in their employer's face was visible. The man who had always been confident and composed was now pale, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, and an expression of someone who had just woken from a nightmare to find that reality was even worse. Edward led them to a private room the hospital had made available. They sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs, and for a moment no one knew exactly how to begin. It was Rose who broke the silence, her voice low but firm. "Mr. Edward, before I tell you everything, I need you to know that I never wanted to cause trouble. I tried to speak up before several times, but I was afraid of losing my job, of not being able to support my son. But yesterday, when I saw Mrs. Fiona lying so shamelessly, when I saw Mrs. Helena collapse, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Edward gestured for her to continue, unable to speak due to the lump tightening his throat. "It all started about 8 months ago," Rose continued. "That's when Mrs. Fiona completely took over Mrs. Helena's care. At first it seemed like a good thing. She said she wanted to give her mother-in-law special attention, that she had studied nutrition for the elderly. But soon I started noticing strange things. The portions of food I prepared for Mrs. Helena were always too small, and Mrs. Fiona wouldn't allow me or any other staff member to take food directly to her. Everything had to go through her first." Edward listened with growing attention, each word confirming the horrible suspicions he had begun to have. "One day," Rose went on, "I went up to clean the master bedroom and found some small glass vials with no labels. They were kept in the drawer of Mrs. Fiona's bedside table. I was curious because it didn't look like ordinary medicine. I tried to get a closer look, but just then Mrs. Fiona came in. She was furious. She threatened me, said if I kept snooping I'd lose my job, that it would be a shame for my son to lose the stability we had." "And the vials?" Edward asked, his voice tense. "Did you manage to see what was in them?" "Not at that moment. But later, I started watching more from a distance, and I saw Mrs. Fiona using those liquids, putting drops in the soups and teas she took to Mrs. Helena, always in secret, always when she thought no one was watching." It was then that Lucas spoke up, his childish voice surprisingly firm. "I saw it too, Mr. Edward, many times. Mrs. Fiona did bad. Fiona. Things to Grandma Helena." Edward looked at the boy, seeing the seriousness in his eyes. "What kind of things, Lucas?" The boy opened the bag he had brought and took out an old, worn-covered notebook. "I wrote everything down here, with the dates, because my mom always taught me that when you see something wrong, you have to have proof or no one will believe you." Edward took the notebook with trembling hands and began to read. The notes were simple, written in a child's uneven handwriting, but they were devastatingly specific. There were dates, times, descriptions of behavior. One entry read, "June 15th, 3 in the afternoon. I saw Aunt Fiona put drops from a little bottle in Grandma Helena's soup. Grandma ate the soup and then got very sick, throwing up. Aunt Fiona smiled." Another entry from July. "Grandma Helena was crying because she was hungry. I snuck her a piece of bread. Aunt Fiona saw me and pinched my arm hard, said if I told anyone she would hurt my mum." Page after page, a meticulous record of cruelty. Edward felt bile rise in his throat as he read. How had this happened in his own house, under his own roof, without him noticing? "There's more," Rose said softly. "Lucas, show him the other things you brought." The boy took some crumpled papers from the bag. They were photos taken with an old cell phone, blurry but identifiable images of the vials, of Fiona adding something to a bowl, of a visibly thin and gaunt Helena. There was also a piece of paper with a handwritten list of substances, in a script Edward recognized as Fiona's. "I managed to take a picture of this paper when Mrs. Fiona left it in the kitchen once," Lucas explained. "I don't know what it means, but I thought it was important." Edward looked at the list. They were names of substances he didn't know, but he wrote them all down to show the doctors later. "You two are incredibly brave," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved my mother. I will never be able to thank you enough." Rose wiped away the tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Edward, there's something I need to say. I tried to feed Mrs. Helena in secret a few times. When Mrs. Fiona went out, I would go up with real food, but it was very risky and I could only do it a few times. It was never enough to really help. I feel so guilty for not doing more." "You did what you could," Edward replied, "and you did infinitely more than I did, who should have been protecting my mother and failed completely." They spent the next hour organizing all the evidence, all the information. Edward photographed every page of Lucas's notebook, every blurry image, every note. He took the list of substances to the doctor in charge of Helena's care, and the expression on the professional's face, as she read those names, confirmed the worst. Some of these substances are known to cause severe nausea, vomiting, and interference with nutrient absorption, the doctor explained. Administered regularly in small doses, they could easily cause the state of malnutrition and weakness your mother is presenting. "Mr. Anderson, this is very serious. We are talking about something that will need to be investigated by the proper authorities." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of that reality crush his chest. He knew what he had to do now. He knew his life would never be the same, that the marriage he had built was based on a lie, that the woman who had slept beside him for 7 years was capable of unimaginable cruelty. But first, he needed to ensure his mother was safe and that there would be justice. While Edward dealt with the doctors and began contacting lawyers, Rose and Lucas waited outside. The housekeeper was exhausted physically and emotionally. She knew that by revealing everything, she had burned her bridges. She could no longer work at the Anderson mansion. Fiona would certainly make sure of that, but at least she had done the right thing for the first time. In months, Rose felt she could breathe without the weight of guilt and fear suffocating her. 2 days passed. Helena remained in the hospital, receiving intravenous nutrition and constant care. She had begun to wake up for longer periods, and although she was still very weak, the doctors said that with proper treatment she would recover. Edward practically lived at the hospital, refusing to leave his mother alone. He had blocked all of Fiona's attempts to visit, something that had infuriated his wife. At the mansion, the situation was tense. Fiona realized something had changed. Edward hadn't returned home since the night of the disastrous dinner. He answered her calls with cold monosyllables, and when she tried to go to the hospital, she was stopped by security guards he had hired specifically for that purpose. The mask of concern Fiona had maintained was beginning to crack, revealing something darker underneath. It was on the afternoon of the 3rd day that things reached a breaking point. Edward returned to the mansion, accompanied by 2 lawyers and a private investigator. He found Fiona in the living room, drinking tea as if nothing was wrong. The sight of that false normality, that theater of serenity, awakened a rage in him he never knew he possessed. "Fiona, we need to talk," he said, his voice icy. She turned to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're finally back. Edward, darling, we need to clear up this whole misunderstanding. This situation with your mother is being misinterpreted, and that hysterical housekeeper—" "Her name is Rose," Edward interrupted sharply. "And she wasn't hysterical. She was telling the truth I refused to see because I was too blinded by the trust I placed in you." Fiona's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" Edward threw a folder onto the coffee table. Inside were copies of all the evidence: the photos, Lucas's notes, the medical reports, the list of substances. "I'm talking about what you did to my mother, what you've been doing for months, systematically destroying her health, starving her, administering substances that made her sick. Why, Fiona? Why?" Fiona opened the folder and quickly leafed through the contents. Edward saw the change in her face, the mask finally falling completely. She was no longer the elegant, controlled wife. She was something cold, calculating, dangerous. "You don't understand anything," she said finally, her voice low but laced with venom. "Your mother always looked at me as if I wasn't good enough for you. She always treated me like an intruder, like someone who was only here for the money. She never truly accepted me. Never." "So you decided to kill her slowly?" Edward didn't recognize his own voice, distorted by anger and horror. "You decided to torture her because your own insecurities couldn't handle judgments that perhaps only existed in your head." "They weren't just judgments," Fiona screamed, losing her composure for the first time. She was planning to change the will. "I heard her talking to her lawyer on the phone. She was going to reduce my share of the inheritance, put in clauses that would exclude me from important business decisions. Years of marriage, years of striving to be the perfect wife, and she was going to take everything from me." Edward felt nauseous. So it was about money, about power, about an inheritance she had no right to claim as her own. "My mother had every right to do what she wanted with her own money. And even if she was planning changes, that doesn't give you the right to what? Survive? Protect my future?" Fiona laughed, a bitter, empty sound. "You live in your privileged world, Edward, never having to worry about where your next dollar will come from. I came from a family that lost everything. I know what it's like to have no security. I wasn't going to let your mother take away what was mine by right." "It was not yours by right," Edward replied, each word as heavy as lead. "And now, none of it is yours. I want you out of this house, today. My lawyers will file for divorce tomorrow, and, depending on what the investigations reveal, you could face consequences far more serious than just losing money." Fiona stood up, her face contorted in a mask of fury and desperation. "You can't do this. I'm your wife." "You were my wife," Edward corrected. "Now you're just someone who terribly hurt the person I love most in the world, and I will make sure you pay for it, in every way possible." It was at that moment that Rose entered the room. Edward had called her to be present for this confrontation, and she had brought with her the original vials. She had managed to collect from Fiona's room in the preceding days. while her employer was at the hospital, trying to see Helena. Vials that were now being analyzed by a forensic lab. "You," Fiona spat upon seeing Rose. "You destroyed everything. An insignificant maid destroyed years of planning." Rose looked at her without fear. "I saved a life. You were going to kill Mrs. Helena, slowly, cruelly, but you were going to kill her. And I wasn't going to let that happen even if it cost me everything." Fiona lunged towards Rose, but Edward stepped between them. "Don't you dare touch her," he said, his voice low but filled with threat. "Rose has shown more courage and dignity than you will ever possess. She is 10 times the person you ever were." 2 security guards entered the room, hired by Edward specifically for this moment. He turned to his wife one last time. "You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and leave. Anything you leave behind will be inventoried and held until the division of assets is legally settled. And Fiona, if you try to contact my mother, if you try to come near this house again, without authorization, I will use every resource I have to ensure you face the severest possible consequences." Fiona looked at them for a long moment, and Edward saw all the emotions flash across her face. Anger, fear, desperation, and finally, a bitter resignation. Without another word, she went upstairs to pack her bags. Edward turned to Rose. "I can never thank you enough," he said. "You and Lucas saved my mother. You saved her when I completely failed." Rose shook her head, tears streaming. "You didn't fail, Mr. Edward. You trusted someone you loved. It's not your fault that person didn't deserve your trust." An hour later, Fiona left the mansion carrying 2 suitcases. She didn't look back. She simply got into a cab and drove away, leaving behind the 7 years of marriage that had been built on lies and manipulation. Edward watched the car disappear down the avenue, feeling a mixture of relief and profound sadness. Relief because the nightmare was ending. Sadness because the life he thought he had built had never truly existed. In the following days, the full truth began to emerge. The lab results confirmed that the vials contained substances that caused nausea, vomiting, and interference with nutrient absorption. The doctors confirmed that Helena had been systematically poisoned and deprived of adequate food. An investigation was opened, and although the legal process would be complex and lengthy, it was clear that Fiona would face serious consequences. Helena, still in the hospital but now significantly stronger, was finally able to tell her own version of events. With tears in her eyes, she described months of silent suffering, of constant hunger, of strange substances that made her feel horribly ill. She described how she had tried to ask for help, but Fiona was always present, always controlling who could visit, always with a plausible explanation for her condition. She described the fear she felt, the confusion, the growing certainty that she was being intentionally destroyed, but not knowing how to prove it or whom to turn to. "When you blocked my attempts to change the will," Helena told her son, holding his hand with a surprising strength for someone so frail, "I knew she was truly determined. You trusted her so much, Edward. I didn't want to destroy your marriage with accusations I couldn't prove, so I suffered in silence, hoping someone would notice." And Rose noticed. That wonderful woman noticed. Edward wept openly as he listened to his mother's account. He wept for the pain she had suffered, for his own blindness, for the betrayal of someone he had completely trusted. But he also wept with relief, because it wasn't too late. Because his mother was alive, she was recovering, and the truth had finally come to light. And when Rose came to visit them in the hospital, bringing Lucas with her, Helena held the hands of the housekeeper and the child with a gratitude that transcended words. "You are my real family," she said, "united not by blood, but by something stronger, by courage, truth, and love." The Anderson mansion needed to be rebuilt, not just physically but emotionally, and that work was just beginning. The first rays of spring sunlight touched the gardens of the Anderson mansion with a softness that seemed to promise new beginnings. 3 months had passed since that terrible night of the dinner, 3 months that had completely transformed the lives of everyone who inhabited that property. The house that once breathed tension and secrets now exuded something different, something Edward had taken time to recognize but could finally name. It was hope. It was peace. It was the feeling that finally, after so long, this place could once again be a true home. Helena was sitting in a rocking chair in the garden, a light wool shawl over her shoulders to protect her from the morning chill. Her face, which 3 months ago had looked like a pale skeletal mask, now had color again. Her cheeks were rosy, her eyes shone with the vivacity Edward remembered from his childhood, and she could smile without the simple act seeming to require a superhuman effort. She was still thinner than she should be. The doctors had warned that a full recovery would take time, but the transformation was remarkable. Helena was becoming herself again, day by day, meal by meal, smile by smile. Beside her, on a low stool, Lucas was reading an adventure book aloud. The boy had become a constant presence in Helena's life, and the friendship between the 73-year-old woman and the 10-year-old boy had blossomed into something deeply moving. Lucas visited her every morning before his classes, every afternoon after finishing his homework, and often they would simply sit beside each other in shared silence, both finding comfort in the other's presence. Rose watched the scene from the porch, a cup of coffee in her hands. She still couldn't quite believe how her life had changed. After Fiona's expulsion, Edward had insisted that Rose remain at the mansion, but no longer as a mere employee. She now held a position of trust, something between a housekeeper and a companion to Helena. Her salary had tripled, Lucas had his own room in the main wing of the house, and most importantly, she was treated with genuine respect and consideration. For the first time in her life, Rose felt that her value was recognized, that her courage had made a real difference. Edward walked through the gardens that morning, watching his mother and the boy. He still carried the guilt like a constant weight. Every night before sleeping, he would find himself reliving the signs he had ignored, the opportunities he had missed to see the truth. How had he been so blind? How had he allowed his love and trust to be so completely manipulated? He had started therapy shortly after the events, on the recommendation of his lawyer, and also out of personal need. He was learning to process the betrayal, to deal with the guilt, to forgive himself for being deceived. It was a long and painful process, but a necessary one. The divorce from Fiona was in progress. The lawyers handled the paperwork, the division of assets from which, ironically, Fiona would receive far less than she would have if she hadn't succumbed to her own greed and cruelty. The criminal proceedings were also moving forward, albeit slowly, as is typical of the justice system. Fiona faced serious charges, and although Edward knew that justice would take time, he was determined to see the case through to the end. Not for revenge, but for principle, because what Fiona had done could not simply be forgotten or forgiven without consequences. "Good morning, Mum," Edward said, approaching and kissing Helena's forehead. "How are you feeling today?" "Better every day, son," she replied, and her voice, though still a bit weak, was firm. "Especially with this wonderful company. Lucas was telling me about the book he's reading in school, Pirates and Hidden Treasures. It reminds me of the stories your father used to tell me when we were young." Edward smiled, feeling a pang of emotion. His mother rarely mentioned his father, who had passed away more than 10 years ago. Hearing her speak of him with joy instead of melancholy was another sign of her recovery. "Sit down, son," Helena invited, gesturing to an empty chair beside her. "We need to talk about a few things." Edward sat, a slight concern crossing his face. "Mom, if it's about the will, we've already talked about that. You don't need to worry about—" "It's not about the will," she interrupted gently. "Well, not exactly. It's about this house, about what it represents for us now." Edward waited for her to continue, watching his mother's face intently. "This mansion was once the scene of a great deal of pain," Helena began, choosing her words carefully. "For months, every room held terrible secrets. Every meal was a battlefield I fought alone. Every night was a terror of not knowing if I would wake up the next day. But now, son, now this house is transforming into something new, something better." She paused, looking at Lucas, who continued to read, pretending not to pay attention to the adult's conversation, but clearly hearing every word. "This house is becoming a real home, not because we have money or because it's big and beautiful, but because it is now inhabited by people who genuinely care for one another." Rose and Lucas have taught us something fundamental. They've taught us that family isn't defined by blood or marriage contracts, but by loyalty, courage, and true love. Edward felt his eyes sting. I learned that in the most painful way possible, Mum. I trusted the wrong person and almost lost you because of it. Helena reached out and touched her son's face. You trusted because you have a good heart, Edward. Don't let what happened turn you into someone cynical and suspicious. Learn from it, yes. Be more attentive to the signs, yes, but don't close your heart. Promise me that. I promise to try, Edward replied, his voice choked. But it will take time. Maybe a long time. We have time, she said simply. We have all the time in the world, and we have wonderful people around us to remind us of what truly matters. Rose approached at that moment, carrying a tray with fresh fruit and natural juice. Mrs. Helena, it's time for your morning snack, she said with a smile. And you too, Mr. Edward. You need to eat better. You're looking very thin. Edward laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even himself. Rose, you sound exactly like my mother used to when I was a teenager. Someone has to look after you, Rose replied with maternal firmness. Especially now that you no longer have a wife to do it, although honestly, that woman never looked after anyone but herself. The mention of Fiona still caused a pang, but Edward was learning to deal with it. You're right, and I'm grateful to have you here, to have both of you, he added, looking at Lucas. You saved more than my mother's life. You saved this entire family. Lucas stopped reading and looked at Edward with those eyes that were too serious for a child. I just did what was right, Mr. Edward. My mom always taught me that when we see someone suffering, we have to help, even when it's hard, even when we're scared. That is a precious lesson, Helena said, reaching out to hold Lucas's hand. Your son is a special boy, Rose. You should be very proud. Rose felt tears well up, as they often had in recent months. Every time she saw Helena healthy, every time she saw the respect with which she was treated, every time she saw Lucas being valued for his courage instead of being invisible as he had always been, she became emotional. I am, Mrs. Helena, more than I can express. The following days brought more changes to the mansion. Edward had decided to do some renovations, not out of structural necessity, but for symbolic reasons. The room that had been his and Fiona's was completely redesigned. New furniture, new colors, a completely different energy. Helena's room also underwent a transformation. It was now a bright space, decorated with photographs of happy moments, with fresh flowers changed daily, with a comfortable armchair where Lucas would often sit to read to her. The kitchen, which had once been a place of manipulation and disguised cruelty, became the heart of the house. Rose supervised the preparation of all meals, ensuring that every dish was nutritious, tasty, and made with genuine love. She had hired an assistant, a young woman named Marina, who came from the same Bronx community where Rose had grown up, and the two worked in harmony, turning that space into a place of warmth and welcome. Edward began to spend more time at home and less time obsessively immersed in business. He realized that he had almost lost his mother, partly because he was always absent, always too busy to pay real attention. He had reorganized his priorities, delegated more responsibilities to trusted managers, and now reserved every morning and every evening to be present at the mansion. He had breakfast with his mother, listened to Lucas talk about school, and chatted with Rose about household matters. Simple things, but things he had begun to value more than any business, meeting or million-dollar contract. One afternoon, as they were walking through the gardens, Helena shared something she had been thinking about. Edward, I need to tell you something about those terrible months. Something I haven't said yet. Edward stopped walking, looking at his mother with concern. What is it, Mom? There were moments when I almost gave up, she began, her voice low. Moments when the pain and weakness were so intense that I thought it might be easier to just let go, to stop fighting. But do you know what kept me alive? Two things. Edward waited, holding his mother's hand. First, you. The hope that you would eventually realize what was happening. The faith that my son, my loving and intelligent boy, would not completely abandon me. And second, she continued, her voice breaking, Rose and Lucas. That woman and that child, who had no obligation to me, who had everything to lose by helping me, kept finding ways to show me that I wasn't alone. Small, hidden portions of food, kind words whispered when no one else was around. Lucas's notebook that I knew he was keeping, even when he thought I didn't know, those acts of courage and kindness reminded me that it was worth continuing to fight. Edward hugged his mother carefully, feeling the tears run freely. "I'm so sorry, Mom. So sorry it took me so long to realize. So sorry you went through that alone for so long." "But I didn't go through it alone," Helena replied, pulling back to look into her son's face. "That's the most important thing I've learned from all this. I was never alone. Rose and Lucas were there. And you, in the end, were there too. Fiona wanted to isolate me, wanted to make me believe that no one cared, that I was a burden, but she was wrong. And in the end, love won over cruelty." The weeks turned into months, and Helena's recovery continued to progress. She could now walk without assistance, though she still tired easily. Her weight was almost back to normal. Her skin had color and life. Her eyes shone with the intelligence and vivacity that had always characterized her. The doctors were impressed with her resilience, with her willpower. But Helena knew it wasn't just willpower, it was love. It was having reasons to live, it was being surrounded by people who genuinely cared. Lucas was also flourishing. With Edward's financial support, he had started more intensive physical therapy for his leg. The doctors believed that with proper treatment, he might eventually need his crutches less, perhaps even walk without them. But the most important thing was how the boy was growing in confidence. He was no longer the shy, invisible child who hid in the corners. Now he laughed loudly, participated in conversations, and shared his opinions with a security that came from knowing he was valued and heard. One evening, 6 months after the events that changed everything, Edward organized a special dinner. Not a social event with influential guests, but something intimate and meaningful. Just him, Helena, Rose, and Lucas. The table was set in the smaller, cozier dining room with lit candles and fresh flowers. Rose had prepared a special menu, Helena's favorite dishes made with all the love in the world. As they ate, laughing and talking, Edward looked around the table and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt complete. This, he realized, was his true family. Not defined by traditional blood ties or legal contracts, but by something much deeper. By mutual sacrifice, by shared courage, by true and unconditional love. "I'd like to propose a toast," Edward said, raising his glass. The others did the same, even Lucas, who had a glass of juice. "To family. Not the family we're born into or choose for convenience, but the family we find when we need it most. To the family that is formed through acts of courage and kindness." "To family," Rose repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "To true family," Helena added, looking at each of them with overflowing love. "To family," Lucas said, his smile lighting up his whole face. They toasted, and in that moment, in the soft candlelight, in the simplicity of that scene, there was a perfection that no money could buy. The Anderson mansion, which had once been a stage for suffering and manipulation, had transformed into a true home, a place where people cared for each other, where truth was valued above appearances, where love was more important than power or wealth. In the following months, life continued its course with a normality that seemed miraculous. Helena returned to her favorite activities, tending to her gardens, hosting friends for tea, participating in the charity work that had always been important to her. Rose enrolled in a night course in business administration, encouraged by Edward, who saw in her a potential far greater than she herself realized. Lucas continued his studies and treatments, growing strong and confident under the loving care of 3 adults who deeply valued him. Edward, for his part, had learned lessons that would change the rest of his life. He had learned that danger can wear elegant clothes and smile with beautiful lips. He had learned that heroes don't always come from expected places. Sometimes they are humble women with brave sons. He had learned that trusting is important, but paying attention is essential. And most importantly, he had learned that when all seems lost, when darkness seems to have won, there is still light. There is always light, if we have the courage to look for it. The case against Fiona eventually resulted in significant consequences. She would not face years in prison due to the legal complexities of the case, but she lost almost everything. Her reputation was destroyed, the high society friends who avoided her, as if she were a contagious disease, the impossibility of finding a job in her field due to the case's publicity. She had left New York, Edward had learned from indirect sources, trying to rebuild a life somewhere no one knew her story. He felt no pleasure in this, only a distant sadness. Sadness for the person she could have been if she had chosen the path of love instead of greed. A year after that terrible night of the dinner, the Anderson mansion was celebrating something very different. It was Helena's birthday, and for the first time in over a year, she was surrounded by people who truly loved her. There were no hundreds of guests, just close friends and, of course, Rose and Lucas, who were now an inseparable part of the family. Helena blew out the candles on her cake, and as everyone applauded, she looked around with eyes misty with happy tears. "A year ago, I was convinced I wouldn't live to see this day," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But here I am, surrounded by true love, surrounded by my real family, and I can't imagine a greater blessing than this." Edward hugged his mother, feeling a deep gratitude for having her back, for having had a second chance to do things right. Rose and Lucas joined the hug, and for a moment they remained like that, four people from such different worlds, united by experiences that had transformed and molded them into something new, something stronger. The Anderson mansion would continue to be an imposing place on the Upper East Side. Its marble walls would continue to gleam in the sun, its gardens would remain perfectly manicured. But now it was more than that. It was a testament that evil can be defeated, that truth eventually prevails, that courage can come from the most unexpected places. It was a reminder that family is not about blood or money, but about who stands by your side when darkness falls, who fights for you when you don't have the strength to fight for yourself, who chooses what is right even when it costs everything. And as the sun set over New York City on that night of celebration, casting golden hues over the mansion and its inhabitants, there was a sense that everything was exactly where it should be. Helena was healthy and happy. Rose had security and respect. Lucas had a future full of possibilities, and Edward had learned the most important lessons of his life, lessons about humility, about paying attention, about valuing the right people for the right reasons. The story of the Anderson family could have ended in tragedy. It could have been a story about how greed and cruelty destroy lives, but instead it became a story of redemption, of courage, of the transformative power of true love. It became a story of how, even in the darkest moments, when it seems all hope is lost, there is always a light waiting to be found, there is always someone willing to light a candle in the darkness. And sometimes those people come from the most unlikely places, proving that true heroes rarely wear capes or have superpowers. Sometimes they are just ordinary people with extraordinary hearts, willing to risk everything to do what is right. And that, in the end, is the most powerful story of all. The story that good can still win, that truth still matters, that love still has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. The Anderson mansion would stand for many years, and those who visited would see only a happy family living in harmony. But those who knew the full story would know that there, in those elegant halls and perfect gardens, something extraordinary had happened. There, darkness had been defeated by light. There, lies had been exposed by truth. There, cruelty had been conquered by courage, and that victory, won with so much sacrifice and pain, had made that house more than a mansion. It had made it a true home, finally and completely. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Helena, Edward, Rose, and Lucas has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by the courage of those who faced darkness with love and truth, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you the most on this journey. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing how kindness can transform even the most desperate situations. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, with more stories that will make you reflect on the power of true love and the courage to do what is right, even when everything seems to be against you.